what is malaria? And importantly, why do I have this mosquito drawn here? That seems a little bit weird. Well, the mosquito here is actually pretty important. Malaria is a disease, an infectious and often fatal disease that is transmitted to humans and other animals as well, not just humans, but it's transmitted most often by us being bitten by an infected mosquito. And interestingly, malaria is primarily a disease of the liver and of the red blood cells. And as you'll sort of see in a few minutes here, this kind of explains some of the symptoms that we see in malaria. And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But first, let me zoom in here and let's talk about what happens in a mosquito bite. So here's our skin, right? And we'll say that these are blood vessels under the skin. And here's our blood. And out here is our friendly, well, not so friendly in this case, but our mosquito. And what is she doing here? Like, why are mosquitoes always biting us? Well, it's because they need to feed on blood in order to survive, right? They're like little flying vampires, which incidentally is my personal worst nightmare. So that's what she's doing around here. She's trying to get at our blood by biting us. Real nice. So to do that, she will poke her little proboscis, that's what this pointy mouth thingy is called, a proboscis, through our skin to access all of our blood vessels underneath. And from there, she'll start to suck up some blood, right? And she'll start to fill up her little thieving tummy. And then she'll take off, all satisfied, right? She's happy and she goes off. And that's not usually a problem for us. I mean, I'm not advocating for mosquitoes here. People get bitten by mosquitoes all the time and they're fine. But some mosquitoes, particularly ones that live in certain more tropical parts of the world, right, closer to the equator, like some African countries and some Asian countries and some Latin American countries, some mosquitoes, the majority of which are in these areas, carry a parasite called Plasmodium. And there's a couple different types of Plasmodium, but for now we'll focus on Plasmodium falciparum. Falciparum, because this type causes the highest number of deaths in humans. Alright, so now let's add in some parasites to our mosquito here and see what happens when someone gets bitten by an infected mosquito. And actually, let me point out that I keep saying she when I talk about our mosquito here, and that's because the Plasmodium parasite is usually transmitted by a female Anopheles mosquito. Anopheles is just the genus. And that's because females feed on blood, while the male mosquitoes feed on other things like nectar from flowers and plants and such. So how does she do it? Well, once she's happily sort of drinking our blood, some of the parasites from within her saliva, they'll sort of swim over from inside her mouth to our bloodstream. So that's kind of step one of the infection. And what happens after that is that the parasites, which are actually called sporozoites at this stage, they have their own special name, sporozoites, and there's usually a whole bunch of them. They swim through our bloodstream until they get to our liver. And then they say to themselves, hey, this looks like a really fun place to hang out. Let's stay here for a while. So they do. They actually infect our liver cells, and they hang out in the liver for a couple weeks, usually about 2 weeks. And when they're in our liver cells, they're not just passively hanging out. They're actually reproducing. So they're asexually reproducing, and they're creating thousands of little parasite babies, little offspring. And so they reproduce, and they reproduce, and they reproduce for a couple of weeks until they build up this massive army of merozoites. That's what they're called at this stage, merozoites. And when they're good and ready, they burst out of our liver cells, which obviously kills the liver cell, unfortunately, and they enter back into the bloodstream. And so this form of Plasmodium, merozoites, they're going to go on and infect our red blood cells. So they'll find red blood cells in our bloodstream, not really too hard to do, and from there they'll get inside them. Red cells are their new home. And you know, from here, things get even more interesting. So some of the merozoites, they do exactly what they did in the liver cells. They asexually reproduce. They create tons and tons and tons of new merozoites, which burst out of the red blood cells and go on to infect more red blood cells. But another group of merozoites, once they infect a red blood cell, they kind of shapeshift. They do this really weird thing where they change form. into what are called immature gametocytes, and some will be male and some will be female. And this will all make sense in a minute here, so you'll just have to bear with me for a second, and you'll see what these gametocytes do. So what happens now? Well, when we get bitten by yet another mosquito, right, these darn flying vampires, whether they're infected or not, there's a really good chance that while they're siphoning up our blood, they're going to suck up some of the red blood cells that contain these male and female gametocytes. And here's the really wild thing. The gametocytes need to actually be inside a mosquito's gut to mature. It's incredible. So the male and the female gametocytes, because of the sort of environment within a mosquito's gut, they fuse together to create a zygote. And then this plasmodium zygote goes on to develop into a new sporozoite. Remember the initial infective form? And then the sporozoite goes on and swims back up to the mosquito's salivary glands. So now they're ready to be injected back into another human host. It's incredible. So this is sort of a really bizarre example of the circle of life. Probably not the kind of example you had in mind when you were watching The Lion King, I'd imagine. So these plasmodium parasites rely on both mosquitoes and some warm-blooded animal to reproduce. Unfortunately, this group of warm-blooded animals includes us humans. So before we wrap up, I just want to briefly talk about the symptoms that you'd experience if you had a malaria infection. So it generally takes about 2 weeks after being bitten by an infected mosquito before we start seeing any symptoms. So why is that? Well, remember that the plasmodium sporozoites travel to the liver and hang out for a couple weeks. So them hanging out is exactly what that couple-week asymptomatic period is. But when they sort of burst out of our liver cells and then later on start to burst out of our infected red blood cells, that's when we start to see the classic symptoms of malaria, as we start to lose red blood cells and as the immune system starts to take notice. So when the immune system gets involved, it kicks off a flu-like syndrome. So just picture what you felt like when you last had the flu. It's really similar to that, but quite a bit more dangerous. So things like really high fevers and headache and, muscle pain and just generally feeling really unwell. And there's actually a classic symptom associated with malaria called paroxysm, temperature paroxysm, where the person will sort of cycle between sudden coldness and shivering and fever and sweating. And these paroxysmal symptoms, they kind of come on and off about every 36 to 48 hours, every couple days. And that's because these symptoms are actually directly related to, right, they're representative of these waves of merozoites bursting out of the liver and the infected red blood cells at these staggered sort of cyclical times once they build up enough to launch a new wave, essentially. And remember how I said that red blood cells are getting destroyed? Well, red blood cells, inside them, they have these proteins called bilirubin proteins. And when they leak out into our bloodstream, they tend to deposit under our skin. And just them being there gives our skin a bit of a yellowish tinge. So this is known as hemolytic jaundice. Jaundice referring to the yellowing of the skin, and hemolytic means the bursting of red blood cells, which is why it's happening. So the last thing I'll mention, we classify an illness with malaria into two broad groups, so uncomplicated and severe. So uncomplicated malaria would be an infection where a person has just these symptoms that I've described, right? Flu-like symptoms with this paroxysm and maybe some jaundice. And this type is pretty easily treated with medications. There's anti-malarial drugs that can kill off the plasmodium parasites, and the person can usually get back to being 100% better. But there's also a severe malaria, which is when the person will also develop some serious organ problems, like maybe some lung problems so they can't breathe properly, or some circulatory problems like super low blood pressure, or severe anemia because of all these blood cells that are rupturing. Or they might develop some brain problems, which might make the person really weak, or it might give them a really decreased level of consciousness. So if a person has severe malaria, they need to be taken to a hospital right away, because in addition to the sort of standard anti-malarial drugs, they will likely need intensive care and constant monitoring to maximize their chances of survival. How is malaria diagnosed? Well, we can think about it basically as a three-step process. So remember that malaria is a disease caused by a parasite that's usually transmitted to humans through bites from infected mosquitoes. So if we want to know if someone has malaria, we might start by asking them if they've been bitten, or if they've been to anywhere that infected mosquitoes are known to hang around, like in certain tropical or subtropical countries. We'd also double check to see if they were having any malaria symptoms, like a flu-like illness, or alternating chills and fevers. That's sort of typical of a malaria illness. So after we have this little conversation with the person, right, that's step one in our three-step process, we would then move on to step two, which is a physical exam. So remember that malaria has two phases. A liver phase, where a whole bunch of sporozoites go in and infect the liver cells, and then reproduce into thousands and thousands of merozoites. And then there's a red blood cell phase, where initially those same merozoites, they burst out of your liver cells and they get into your bloodstream, where they infect your red blood cells. So in the physical exam, well, we kind of look for any clues on the outside of your body that might be able to tell us if these things are happening on the inside of your body. So we know something might be going on in the liver, right? So we actually feel for the liver to see if it's enlarged. Because all of the inflammation that would be happening if the liver cells were bursting or if they were infected, that would make the liver enlarge a bit. The other physical things we look for on a person mostly have to do with red blood cells. So once the red blood cells start to get infected, or once they start to get damaged, right, because of all these merozoites that are infecting them, these damaged red blood cells start to collect in the spleen, which lives all the way over here beside the stomach. And the spleen is responsible for screening our blood and sort of pulling out and recycling any old or damaged red blood cells. So all of these damaged red blood cells are all of a sudden going to start filtering into the spleen. And that'll cause some congestion in the spleen. And, there's also some inflammation happening in here too now. So the spleen starts to enlarge, starts to get bigger. And in some cases it can enlarge really, really massively. So we try to feel for an enlarged spleen. And remember, red blood cells are bursting, right? And having lots and lots of nice, healthy red blood cells is part of what gives us humans our nice, warm coloring, right, to our skin. So if we're losing lots of red blood cells, we would start to go pretty pale. So we look for pallor, which just means abnormal paleness that happens when you don't have enough red blood cells circulating around. And this pallor is easiest to see in the hands and in the face. And then finally we might look for jaundice, which will happen when bilirubin from inside the red blood cells get out and deposit under our skin. Good, so that's step two. That's our physical exam. Now on to step three. This is the most specific, the most definitive way of diagnosing malaria. And it is a couple of lab tests. So there's a few different tests we can do to diagnose malaria, but I'll just describe the two most common ways. So one way is by a blood smear. So we take some blood from the person and we stick it on a microscope slide. You can see my nice microscope slide here with blood on it. And then we look at it under a microscope to try to sort of directly, visually pick out any malaria parasites, right? Just using our own two eyes. So you might have heard of a test called a thick and thin film. And that's actually what this is here. You can see that there's one sort of puddle of blood that's really thin. And the other puddle is a bit thicker, right? There's a bit more blood here. And anytime we look at blood under a microscope, we just call it a blood film. So why do we need both the thick and the thin films? Well, in the thick film, we can zoom in a bit here. This is our thick film if we were to look at it through a microscope. This gives us a really broad view of the person's blood. So there's a good amount of blood here that we can see all at once within our microscope's field of view. So we're pretty quickly able to tell if it looks like there might be any parasites hanging around in there. And indeed, in this thick film, we can see that, maybe that's a little plasmodium there, and maybe there's something going on over there, and maybe over there. Again, the main thing with this thick film is that we can look at lots at once to make sure we're getting a good representative sample of the person's blood. But we don't get too much detail in a thick film. And in fact, remember that there's a couple different types of plasmodium. There's falciparum, there's vivax, there's ovale. But we can't really differentiate them on a thick film. We need our thin film for that. So let's move over to our thin film. And you can immediately see that it's a lot more detailed, right? Because it's thin, right? It's basically just a single layer of blood cells. They're not sort of all jumbled all over each other like in the thick film. So we can see more detail. And we can already see that there's some trophozoites in these red blood cells. It's kind of weird, but this used to be the merozoite that infected this red blood cell initially. And now it's turned into a trophozoite, which is what goes on to multiply into tons more merozoites. It reverts back to being called a merozoite once it starts to reproduce. And then here's a red cell where that's already happened, right? This red cell is packed with merozoites. So we can definitely see that this person has a malaria parasite infection just by looking at the blood films. And we can actually also pick out this falciparum subtype of plasmodium on this thin film. And right here's a vivax subtype. So on a thin film, we can tell the difference. All right, one last test we'll talk about. So this one's called a rapid detection test, or an RDT. And this will give us our results in only about 15 minutes. And you don't really need any training to do it. Whereas our thick and thin films, although theoretically they could be done really quickly, first of all, you need a microscope. And second, you need someone with a really skilled eye to actually look at the blood films. And these might not always be available. So RDTs, how do they work? Well, essentially you take a drop of blood from usually a finger prick, and then you actually collect the drop of blood with a special dipstick. And this dipstick is really interesting. It kind of works like the pregnancy tests that can test your urine to see if you're pregnant. Except, obviously, this is testing for malaria, and hopefully using your blood and not your urine. So here's the dipstick, and on it, there's all of these antibodies stuck all over its surface, right? And so these antibodies essentially look for two different things in the blood. So let me set you up here. So when red blood cells get infected with malaria parasites, our red cells start to produce enzymes that end up being displayed. They get stuck onto the outside of our red cell membranes. And so some of the antibodies on the dipstick, they'll be looking to grab onto any of these enzymes that they might be able to find in the blood sample, right? Because that could mean that there's a plasmodium infection. One issue with that is that some of the enzymes only get produced in Plasmodium falciparum infections and not in infections by other types of Plasmodium. And that's still usually okay, because remember, falciparum causes the vast majority of infections. But in any case, the dipstick also looks for something else. So each subtype of Plasmodium produces a slightly different version of an enzyme that they all have, called Plasmodium lactate dehydrogenase, or PLDH. So this is an enzyme that helps the Plasmodium make energy to do all of its dirty work. And so our dipstick, it actually has antibodies on it that can bind to each of the different PLDHs that the different subtypes of Plasmodium would make. So based on the kind of PLDH that our dipstick antibodies bind to, that's how we know what type of malaria parasite we're dealing with. And that's important, because some subtypes need their own special kind of treatment for us to completely remove them from our system. So once malaria has been confirmed by lab or biochemical diagnosis, treatment kind of has to start right away to give the person the best chance of survival, right, with as few complications as possible. So let's say we're going to use anti-malarial drugs to treat the disease, right? So to make sure we're using the right drugs, we'll need to know a few things. So we need to know what type of Plasmodium is causing the infection, because some subtypes will just respond to drugs that others might not. We'll need to know how the patient's doing, right? Is this an uncomplicated malaria, right? With, flu-y symptoms, fevers and chills, that kind of stuff? Or is this severe malaria with systemic, life-threatening symptoms? We'll need to know what we're dealing with. We'll also need to know if these parasites that are causing the infection, we need to know if they're resistant to any of our treatments. Maybe the infection was picked up in, a part of the world known to have treatment-resistant malaria. So there's a couple things we need to know right off the bat before we start treatment. So let's say our patient over here, he has uncomplicated malaria. And let's remind ourselves that uncomplicated is still very serious. It can still be fatal. And our patient over here, let's say he has severe malaria. Notice that this guy, uncomplicated guy, is just hanging out at home, right? He's still really exhausted and flu-y feeling, but he's at home. But severe malaria guy over here, he's in a hospital bed, and he's got an IV in, and he's being monitored, he's being totally looked after by the hospital staff. And that's because for uncomplicated guy over here, he can take his anti-malarial drugs in pill form. He can just take them at home. But severe guy, remember, he's having systemic symptoms. Maybe his blood pressure is dangerously low, or maybe he's severely anemic. Or maybe he has brain symptoms, cerebral malaria, where he's having seizures. Or maybe his brain just isn't controlling his breathing properly, or maybe he's gone into a coma. So he's in hospital because in addition to getting anti-malarials, which he'll get through this IV line here, he won't get them in pill form like this guy over here. He'll need constant medical care to make sure that he survives and with as few permanent complications as possible. So let's talk about the types of medicines that can cure a malaria infection. So remember that there's essentially two stages of infection with malaria. There's a liver phase, where sporozoites infect your liver cells and multiply into thousands of merozoites. And then there's a red blood cell phase, where these little merozoites break out of your liver cells and infect your red blood cells. And once they're inside your red blood cells, they turn into what are called trophozoites. They hang out for a while, and then they multiply into thousands more merozoites again. So we have medications that can destroy these parasites at any of these stages, which is good. So for uncomplicated malaria, the person usually gets treated with combination therapy, which means that they take a few different drugs to treat their malaria. So they take usually 2 to 3 drugs, because if you just use one drug to treat a malaria infection, well, pretty quickly the parasites are gonna figure out how to become resistant, right? How to avoid being killed by that one drug. And in fact, this is already a huge problem. There's already a lot of drug resistance that's cropped up in different parts of the world. So that's why it's super important to use combination therapies to make sure that no potentially mutated parasites survive after treatment. Otherwise, one day we just won't have any drugs left that work. So the recommended combination for treating uncomplicated malaria is called ACT, artemisinin combination therapy. And artemisinin here is actually the name of a plant that we get this main drug in this combo from. The drug is called artesunate, and we get it from the artemisinin plant. So artesunate does a few things. It creates a really toxic environment in the parasites that can kill them. And it interferes with some pretty important proteins on the plasmodium surface that allow them to get their nutrients. So that makes it hard for them to stay alive too. And the reason that ACT is built around this artesunate drug here is because artesunate is really, really effective against all of the types of plasmodium. And because there's not really much resistance to it right now, which is great. So the standard combo is artesunate plus some other drug with a different mechanism of action. So, for example, one that's commonly used is mefloquine here, which disrupts the acid-base balance in the parasite, and that's often lethal to the parasite. Or sometimes you'll get a combo of 2 synergistic drugs, sulfadoxin and pyrimethamine, which stops the malaria from being able to replicate its DNA properly, which means it just can't really reproduce very well in our bodies. These are just examples. There's other possibilities as well, though. So what I just told you, all this ACT stuff, that's the standard treatment of uncomplicated malaria caused specifically by Plasmodium falciparum. ACT is really good at clearing a falciparum infection from the bloodstream. Plasmodium vivax, on the other hand, that has to be treated in a different way. So for the blood stage, you could still use ACT, just like with falciparum. Or often a drug called chloroquine is used. But there's a fair amount of resistance to chloroquine amongst malaria parasites nowadays, mostly in Southeast Asia. But how does chloroquine work? Well, malaria parasites feed on blood. They actually like the hemoglobin component of red blood cells. That's why they have such a blast in our bloodstream. But when they're busy digesting the hemoglobin from a red blood cell, they release the heme part of the hemoglobin molecule, right? So it's just kind of floating around because they don't want to eat it. They just eat the globin part. And free heme floating around here is actually toxic to both them, the parasites, and to the red blood cell that they're hanging around in. So because they want to stick around in the red cell for a while, and, of course, because they want to live, the parasites convert this heme into crystals of hemozoin, which is not toxic to the cell or to them. So chloroquine, and actually mefloquine does this as well, these drugs prevent the parasites from converting the toxic heme into non-toxic hemozoin crystals, right? So all of the resulting heme, it builds up and it just makes the environment really toxic, and then the parasites end up dying, which is great. So that's the blood stage with Plasmodium vivax. But vivax is interesting, though. It likes to hang out in the liver as well, in a dormant phase, unlike falciparum. Falciparum sort of gets on with it and causes super severe infection pretty quickly. Whereas vivax, right, while it can still be really severe, it takes it a bit slower. So it likes to transform into what are called hypnozoites. And then these hypnozoites take naps in the liver cells for extended periods of time. So it's kind of like having a chronic malaria infection with vivax. So you have to kill the liver parasites, and you can do that with primaquine, which is actually effective against all types of malaria, but we especially like it for how it deals with the vivax hypnozoites. Anyway, the primaquine works by blocking oxidative metabolism in these hypnozoites in the liver, so it stops them from being able to make enough energy to survive, so they die. Now, those are just the basic ideas of how you treat uncomplicated falciparum and vivax. You can see that there's quite a few different things to think about. But if someone has severe malaria, right, this guy over here, there's pretty much one thing that you always do. You stick in an IV, an intravenous line, right, and you give the person artesunate. Remember that main drug in the ACT combo therapy. And they can't take it in pill form. They need it to go straight into their bloodstream because there's not really any time to fiddle around with pills and all that. So besides the IV artesunate, the person will need supportive treatment. Remember, in severe malaria, the person might be having seizures, or they might be in a coma, or they might not be able to breathe on their own. So they're going to need a respiratory support. And they'll probably also be really dehydrated, so they'll need fluids and electrolytes as well. So what sort of prognosis can you expect with malaria treatment? Well, if you get proper treatment, then usually you can expect a full recovery, especially with uncomplicated malaria. And this is all usually true with severe malaria too, but it's important to keep in mind that severe malaria can progress really quickly, and it can also be a bit unpredictable. So even with treatment and intensive care, it still often leads to death.